we'll go ahead and as we begin the meeting. We've got a little bit smaller group. I think maybe just middle of summer and that, or beginning of summer. When today's the first day, right? So people are out about and doing some things in that. Looks like this week, but we do have a good audience on the Zoom. So thank you everybody for joining. Special thank you to Marc Morris with Tamron Lens, representative here, Rocky Mountain region, and that he's going to be going through a presentation tonight on Tamron lenses. And for those of you who are out there on Zoom land, there's a really impressive table full here of expensive gear that's sitting in front of me. So looking forward to hearing some about the products that
the three lenses that were available.
Yeah, that's right. Those that are here in attendance, there's going to be a raffle for three lens of your choice, right?
Three has several definitions this evening, I think.
Must be present to win.
And I do want to also just add, it's not on Tamron lenses, it's on all lenses. It's
all lenses. Okay.
This is a lens technology presentation, so it's brand agnostic.
Okay, great. Looking forward to it. So we'll get that going here in a few minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to go through a couple of announcements, and then we have some of the ribbons and that from last month's competition, or I guess this month's competition a couple of weeks ago. The next, I guess, as far as upcoming events, we've got the Rambler Ranch event is this Saturday, and I don't have the notes on that one, so that is
8 a.m. start to about noon. If you haven't been there before, you can bring a lunch, get a lot of like picnic tables and nights there.
Right.
And it's just a lot of fun. And then Mark will be there with all of us, and you can try them and smell them and whatever you want to do.
Right. So again, it's an opportunity to in the field use your gear, but also test drive some of this really nice Tamron lenses that are out here in that. So again, this Saturday, 8 a.m. to noon at the Rambler Ranch. Again, more information on that is on the website, and I think it's at $25. Is that what the $24 is?
And part of that covers your entrance into the Rambler Ranch.
Great. Okay, great. Thanks. Let's see here. Next competition night is July 5th, and that one is on food and beverage and still life. I think there was a email that went out the other day that there's a correction to that, and that it said food and beverage and stock photography, but we've replaced that with still life. So still life and food and beverage. And hopefully everybody remembers a few of the tips from one of our, I guess, our last presentation when Terry Verbickus presented on food photography. Hopefully you're putting some of those, have a chance to put some of those things into practice and be ready for the competition. And actually Terry will be our judge on that. So again, has a lot of experience with food photography, some with still lifes and so forth and that. So looking forward to that one. So that is July 5th, and entries are due, it would be the Sunday before that. So I think that's July 2nd, I think is what that is. So by the end of Sunday, July 2nd, have your images submitted. And then after that, we have, we don't have a presentation in the month of July, but we have our annual scavenger hunt. So I'm sure Bruce is working hard at putting together a clever list of topics and that. These are always fun. When I think this is about the 4th or 5th year that we've done this, and it's always a real good time. And it's real surprising. It's amazing to see some of the images that come out of, especially when you have to go photograph specific items and so forth and that. We still get real good images that get submitted. So looking forward to that one on July 19th. And then August 2nd, we have another exhibition night. So again, that's similar to our competition nights, but we don't have a judge. You don't get scored on images, but it's a great way to submit images and kind of, in your words, describe what it is that you were thinking about when you took the photo. Describe maybe any special processes that you used or procedures you used to process the image, what the image means to you, and then you also get to have the people here in attendance will be able to provide suggestions in that if there's any. So anyways, that's again exhibition night, and that is Wednesday, August 2nd. And then August 16th, we have a presentation on landscape photography, and that's
changed.
Oh,
just got something.
Okay. Hold on, we have a change in this one here.
So Doug Bennett's going to present, but he's going to present it on tonality. It sounds very interesting. And I just got the details today, and I'll post up the information this week.
Okay, great, great. So for that, again, we had it before that it was going to be on landscape photography. I'm sure there will be plenty of landscape scenes in his presentation, but it's going to be specific to tonality with photography. And that's all I had tonight. That just carries us through the end of August. So with that, again, we'll welcome Marc Morris with Tamron, and he's going to be going over, I misspoke earlier, lens fundamentals of optical technology.
Nice.
Excuse me. You could do the awards, right?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So we've got some
pretty
ribbons.
good.
I'm going to make some real quick announcements here on.
Just get boxed.
That's right. That's right. So here we'll start off here real quickly. I will go through the awards.
Everybody stay seated.
Okay, I'll just set them over here. I won't
Sounds
go
like you
walking
need your own
around.
throne,
And,
Jack.
do all that.
Just queen of images. This is good.
So I'm going to start off here with the beginner intermediate monochrome. We have, let's see, honorable mention, and that is Jane Richards for On the Hunt for Breakfast. I just said it right there. Congratulations, Jane. Let's see here. Let's go on to, let's see, this award. Third place, we have Tony Lazzari for Final Last Call. I can't get them all, right? But here we go. Second place, Jane Richards, Graceful. That's second place. And let's move on to, let's see, first place, we have Carolyn Ryman, Oregon's Coast Misty Morning. So you should have come tonight for that, right? And Judges Award, we have Graceful, and that again is Jane Richards. Congratulations. Let's see here. Now we'll move on to
Judges.
beginner intermediate color.
Purchased judging, potentially. Tony didn't win them all.
We'll start off here with the honorable mention, and that one goes to Dale Ralph with Abandon. Let's see. Move on to third place, and third place, Jane Richards with Mushroom Glow. Second place, Bruce Ryman, A Little Help. And first place, Jane Richards with Alert. Congratulations. And the Judges Award again goes to Jane Richards with Mushroom Glow.
I was gonna say, yeah. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Jane.
We've been talking about that.
Sorry about that. I should have had my screen going. Okay, now we're on to, let's see here. Let's go with, this is the advanced monochrome, and, excuse me, honorable mention. We have Rand Nagali with Under the Arc. Third place is Dave Purcell, Dumbo Drop. Congratulations, Dave. Second place, Rand Nagali with Into the Dark. And we have first place was Darren White, You're Not the First I've Seen. And Judges Award, also Darren White, You're Not the First I've Seen. Congratulations all for that.
I like that title.
And the last category here is advanced color. So we have the honorable mention, and that one goes to Jeff Woodward with Under Lights. Third place is Chuck Rasco with Dandelions. Second place, Terry Verbickus, First Light on the Butte. And first place, also Terry Verbickus with Desert Sunrise Glow. And Judges Award, and that is Benjamin Evans for Camouflage. So congratulations all for the awards last night. And thank you, Bruce, for putting all of the ribbons together and making the arrangements for that. So
Do you-
with,
do you guys keep a place on your website for people to see those images, or was this you guys previously?
We put them in the banner and they rotate through,
Nice. Okay.
and then Darren puts them on Facebook and Instagram.
right. Yeah, he's been putting those out there. So
Awesome. I'll go check out the Facebook.
Okay, so with that, now we'll go ahead and turn it over to tonight's presentation with Marc Morris on fundamentals of optical technology.
Nice.
Mhm.
Oh, not even gonna be needed. Just gonna be me. I'm like many photographers. I'm better behind the lens instead of in front of it. I'm gonna grab you. There we go.
Probably should, right? Does it look a little bit better? The screen looks a little bit better too.
It's definitely an OLED. See, Samsung would be very proud of these blacks right now. They're very happy about it. They'll brag to you all day about the nits involved. Oh yeah, that looks good. All right. Well, thanks guys for having me out tonight. This is awesome. My first time at the convention center. It's a sweet building. This is a great space. We should party here more often. This is a little different from a lot of the presentations you might see. I often refer to them as pretty picture presentations, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with those. They're fabulous. You learn how to make pretty pictures. This is definitely not a pretty picture presentation. This is where the nerds come in and play. And if anything, while it is on the fundamentals of optical technology, and it is absolutely relevant to everybody's lenses, this is one manufacturer telling you all you're impossible to please. That's basically what this is. So
excuse me 1 second.
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry about that. On the chat, somebody's asking if we stop sharing. Is it
Yeah, because that's
Are they okay?
live there, it's live here.
okay? Yeah, and I see it here on my screen. So we should.
Yeah.
If somebody on the chat wants to give a quick message, are you seeing the presentation? Yep, he's got it on Zoom. Yep, we're good. Sorry about that.
no, it's all good. Technology was supposed to make things easier, right? This is all supposed to be simple.
And this is alive too. Showing it.
Oh, nice.
I was listening to
Oh, fair. Okay. I feel like I'm being double judged by Bruce over here through his various multiple screens. It's all good. So it's true because it is Tamron sponsored. The first like 5 minutes is about Tamron, so I hope you forgive me for that. But for those of you who don't know a little bit about our company, we're gaining on the 100-year marker. We're almost to our centenary position. We are the world's largest lens manufacturer by 30 times greater than our next closest competitor. To put it in scale, we produce 7 to 9 million lenses a month, and we have nearly 750,000 lens SKUs. So what you see on the table in front of you is really what's visible just to the photographic community. We have an entire industrial optics division that is extravagant and does amazing things. Everything from Coast Guard search and rescue. We do a lot of work in infrared and thermoptics. And if you've ever been busted at a red light, that was probably us also. If you have a backup camera in your car that sees color, it is often a Tamron lens. We get around. And as a lot of people have surmised, it's true, we have an A-list of clients that you know well, and it is often true that you own a Tamron lens without knowing it. We get around. And so we're one of the optical backbones of the photographic industry. We have the most patents for photographic design, more than the big 5 combined. And it's because we're just very good at what we do. We also do crazy things with injection polyelemental components. We work a lot in carbon fiber, fiberglass, and we're experts in glass-based plastics. And so circuit boards that fit into weird places on the space shuttle, those are also things that we do. We mentioned infrared and thermal. We are also on the forefront of LiDAR, so we're helping in the self-driving automobile side of things, and also geographic mapping and satellite work. We are completely vertically integrated, so the components are indeed ours. We make the machines that make the machines that make the lenses. And so we don't really have to worry too much about who we owe outside of the nuts and bolts, because most people don't make those. But it allows us to be on a scale much more cost effective. We have 6 massive factories worldwide, and we can do things at a scale and a cost efficiency That's just not available to most companies. And when people ask me why we're cheaper than, say, a first party quote unquote manufacturer, that's basically why. And also because I don't have a camera budget that I have to sink my outside costs into. Cameras are very expensive and sensors are loss leaders. And so for us, we don't have to worry about those things, and therefore the savings is passed on to you guys. This is one of my favorite images from one of our Vietnam factories. This is a whole bunch of glass molds that are about to be pressed and reseated. These actually often get melted down or resoftened and then pressed for upwards of 6 months in a mold for purification. And then it comes out in the size and shape that we're looking for whatever lens it is we're making it for. So what do? This whole screen here is a portion of it. Obviously photographic lenses, CCTV, IP, security, infrared, thermal, obviously lenses for automotive. You'll see the lenses for digital cameras and video cameras. If you'd owned a camcorder in the past or a compact digital point and shoot, we made most of the lenses for those, no matter whose name was on the front. And it's at one point we were almost 90% of all compact zoom lenses on cameras. In the same way that Sony is 3/4 of the sensors out there, GE Sanyo is 65% of your batteries, Casio is 90% of the screens on the back of your cameras. Tamron is another one of those majors also. We are the only manufacturer that weather seals every lens we produce. We gasket and seal and fluorinate all the front elements. When we say weather sealing, we mean it. We want you to go out and play. We don't expect you to be nice. We'd like you to be nice, but we all know that photographers misbehave constantly. We blame it on the cat when the lens is knocked off the table, but it wasn't the cat. So I'm going to probably skip this video due to bandwidth, but this is where that lens shot was taken. These are the rapids outside of Yellowstone where the Harlequin ducks like to play. It was blizzard conditions. It was saturated, rivulets of water running off of everything. I did work with a wolf preserve for 10 years. My lenses were licked and gnawed and occasionally just kind of snouted, as it were. They are designed for that type of thing. And that's because we fluorinate our front elements. So this is an actual image of a fluorinated front element on the right side and a non-fluorinated left side. This is one of those big Marks-a-Lot markers you might remember from being a kid. So you just draw on it. I will play tic-tac-toe with people on my lenses on a dare. It usually freaks everybody out when we do it, but it just wipes right off. You don't have to worry about it. It's really quite nice. The best filters, by the way, will have that same coating on the fronts as well. We do a 6-year warranty on everything purchased at a U.S. authorized dealer, and our turnaround time on average is 72 hours on all repairs. So it takes longer to ship than it does for us to repair it, and that's the best part about being vertically integrated. We have all the parts. You don't have to wait for something to come from overseas. So that's the Tamron section. I appreciate you guys. From a lens manufacturer standpoint, there are a few things that we all are attempting to do. And the big four there are the first four. These are what all lenses are trying to do for you at any given time. We're trying to keep you as bright as possible. We want as much light transmission to fall from front element to rear element. I need as much light to my sensor for autofocus purposes, for contrast, for color, for information. I'm trying to keep as much light falling through as possible. Neutrality, I don't want an all pink or an all orange or an all blue image. I want something that when white is white, I need white to stay white. With white in the color spectrum being all colors combined equally, if I can get my whites nailed, all the other colors will fall into play. My grays will look good, and my blacks will also look good. I'm trying to keep my color balance where they need to be. I also would like as much information in shadows and highlights as possible, and I don't want edges looking all rainbow and candy colored. I am trying to keep all your lines straight. A building should look like a building. It should not look like a barrel. We are trying hard not to have fisheye problems in every lens out there. I'm also trying to make sure I don't pin cushion everything, which is when it inverts and everything goes convex or concave, excuse me, on the sides. And then lastly, for some reason, you guys insist on buying 45, 50, and 60 megapixel cameras. I don't know why, but you do, and that takes an awful lot of correction. To put it in perspective, the absolute best 35 millimeter film resolutions ever recorded by only 2 film emulsions, one black and white and one color slide, was 24 megapixels. We are well beyond that. Now, it's true that in terms of pixels, if you want a double resolution, you actually have to multiply that number by 4 It's a quadratic equation. But between 24 to 45, that's still almost 50%. That's a considerable portion. And between 24 and 60, you're going to see it. You may not see it on certain monitors at home, but you will definitely see it in a print, and you will certainly see it in larger prints, and you will definitely see it when you need to crop. So when I need to zoom in on a frame, I need to make sure that my lens has the capacity to resolve for that pixel pitch, for that detail. And that is actually really hard to do. At 60 megapixels, believe it or not, only about 50% of the lenses currently manufactured can actually resolve that kind of detail, even in mirrorless lenses. And so it's at a point where we're hoping that the manufacturers of sensors slow things down so we can get to a point of reasonable work. At Tamron, 95% of our lenses are 60 megapixel compliant. Oh, and lastly, yes, metal is not always good. So do not judge a lens's construction by if it has a lot of metal in it. One of the problems with metal is that when it takes a hit, it does not reform back to its original shape. It stays dented, it stays broken, whereas fiberglass and polycarbonate will reform. And so a lens that bounces is oftentimes a lens that does not break. This is shown by a lot of old lenses back in the day, especially the heavy metal chassis. If you had a really terrible turbulent flight, it could knock the lens out of alignment. And that we do see that, it happens. These are jeweler's level precision. And it's best not to shock them in any way, shape, or form. But if you have a fair core of polycarbonates, you will be better at taking a shock than not. Even those big $12,000 600 f4 lenses that have nice metal chassis on the outside, all fiberglass and plastic on the inside. So it's one of those things where it's actually logical to produce along those lines. And also, it's oftentimes less expensive. So there's also a balance there. And yes, of course, we're trying to do all this within reasonable financial restraints. We don't want to pay for it. You don't want to pay for it. This is the one thing that we all agree on. If we can do it from better cost efficiency, then you will rake those awards. So you can't do anything lenses without giving some kudos to our friends over at Leica. This is a Leitz 50 millimeter from 1925. That was good enough to stay in production until 1961. Today's technology doesn't allow for that kind of age work. Today's technology ages like dogs. 1 day is a year as far as computers are concerned. But what this allows us to know is that this lens was pretty good, but it also lets us know that the capture device, the film behind it, didn't progress that wildly in resolution needs as time went forward for nearly 40 years. Once 61 came around and color really got into dominance, we needed to do some better work with glass because we needed to start correcting for color aberrations that black and white never had to worry about. The reason why this is up here is not just because I want to give kudos to Leica for all that they have done for us in the past, but also just this is a really easy example to show you how lenses are described. When you read up on a lens in a tech sheet, they're going to tell you that there's 4 elements, or they're going to say so many elements and so many groups. A group is a control vector inside a lens. It is an optical control vector. We like to be contradictory in the photo industry. We like our acronyms, and we like to be weird. And one of the weird things is that we can present something singular and call it a group. And in lenses, a control vector or a control optic will be its own group. Or like on the back side here, we have a doublet. This doublet is a group in and of itself. This is a control vector that's controlled by 2 lenses at the same time. These guys are here to affect very specific aberrations. These 2 affect aberrations on their own. So I have group 1, group 2, and group 3, but element 1, element 2, 3, and 4. This is a nice, simple design. When you start getting into the crazy ones that are like 21 elements and 15 groups, things get nuts to look at. And I often, especially with my high schoolers, I'll sit them down with one of those charts and I'll see who can guess correctly how the groups and elements are divided. It's a lot of fun. And it puts know-it-all techie 18-year-olds in their place pretty good too. So this is a lens that we produce. This is a modern standard optic, the 45 millimeter. For those who don't know, 43 millimeter is the closest focal length to human vision. We use 50 because 50 is a nice round number, but it's inaccurate. 43 is closer. In this case, 45 is plenty close. The reason why I bring this up is because this is a modern digital optic that's rated at 80 megapixels. And the cool thing is that basically that original Leica design still remains inside of it. You'll recognize those 4 pieces, the 3 groups, 4 elements, and almost exactly the same array as the Leitz design from 1925. And the reason why this works is because this is a lens designed for portrait and glamour work And this is kind of our homage to glamour photography from the 1930s. And it does an outstanding job looking that way. It's a classic design. Lenses will bring their own color palette, their own clarity to the table. They're not always designed for perfect sharpness or seriously divided colors in high saturation, high contrast. Sometimes we need a lens that doesn't do any of those things to get the look that we're going for. And that's why mirrorless is so nice. You can adapt whatever you want from the 1930s on. If there's somebody grinding out metal in a CNC machine that can adapt something old to new, it's worth trying out. In this case, it just happened that we adapted internally and it worked fabulously. So when you're reading up on glass types and lenses, you're basically going to be taught about spherical correction and you're going to be taught about color correction. We have two things for color, and those are the dispersion elements. Anytime you hear the term dispersion, it's when light has decided to scatter into a spectrum. It's if there's one thing white light enjoys doing above all else, it's turning itself into a rainbow at the smallest possible instance. Those big front elements on big telephoto lenses are rainbow producing machines. Once light hits it, it disperses everywhere. It goes into the rainbow flag mode, and the rest of your lens is there trying to bring all the colors back into alignment. When photographers are out there shooting, we think of focus as in making an object sharp, trying to get those details correct. Well, if I'm doing my job correctly as a lens manufacturer, is I'm focusing to get my contrast and my details accurate, I'm also focusing light from colors back into white. I am trying very hard to get all of that put together for you as well. Low dispersion elements are the key to that. Extra low dispersion just basically means, and anytime you hear an anime term in the photography industry, ultra, mega, extra, it's going to just be more expensive. It's harder to build. So if we have a term that says extra low dispersion, you go, well, this lens had issues with color and it was tougher for them to fix it, so they had to put some fancy glass in there. And you'll often see that we're going to combine both the fancy glass and the less fancy glass to get the result that we're going to need. If you judge a lens solely on this factor, though, you will misjudge certain lenses. There are some extraordinarily innovative pieces of glass out there that just don't use extra low dispersion. They were able to do everything with the standard LD glass. Because of that, it lowered the cost to a certain vector, and that's a good thing. But don't judge it just because it doesn't have XLD. Usually where you'll see XLD elements is where they really tried to shrink the lens, where they're trying to really get the size and weight under control. Aspheric elements have been around in force really since the 1980s. If any of you guys bought some of your first zoom lenses in the 80s to early 90s, the word aspheric was all over the box. They wanted you to know that somebody was building an aspheric lens. And we used to have people coming into our stores demanding an aspheric lens. They didn't know what it was, but they knew they wanted it. It happens all the time in technology. Basically, an asphere is a molded piece of glass that it's not spherical, it's not round, often shaped like a cat eye, or a completely concave piece of glass. It looks like a rectangular box that was folded in on itself. The reason why aspheres are so important is because they allowed for correction and light transmission to happen at a smaller scale. So it meant less cost for us and you, less size and weight for everybody, which makes everybody happy. A single molded glass asphere today can replace up to 5 elements of an older lens design. So 1/5 the size, 1/5 the weight. The other bonus of that is that every time light hits a piece of glass, I'm shaving a little bit of it off. Every time light hits a glass, it gets less contrast, it darkens down. I lose a bit of that luminosity. So if I have one element doing the correction work of 5, I'm also keeping 80% more light than I was going to lose previously. So it's better for size, it's better for weight, it's better for corrections, better for transmission. Aspheric elements are important, and they're now almost a dime a dozen. They're everywhere, but they are one of the single most important innovations in optical technology. The expanded glass molded asphere, the last one down there in the bottom, is the reason why the ultra wide angle revolution has been able to take place since Nikon released their 14-24 2.8 almost 15 years ago. So that was the first lens to carry this design. It is a Tamron patent. It is our baby. And it's and without this particular glass mold, today's ultra wide lenses could happen, but they wouldn't be 2.8s. They'd be 5.6s or f8s. If you wanted them to be 2.8s, they wouldn't be 3 pounds, they would be 7. And so this bad boy is an extraordinarily valuable piece of glass. and is the one thing you don't want to break in an ultra wide angle lens. But unfortunately for you, it's typically in the front. But it is the piece that is usually the first or second piece that grabs all of that light from an extraordinarily wide field and begins the focusing correction and intensifying the light before it hits the back. And it looks like this. They're fabulous. I used to have one until somebody stole mine, unfortunately, from one of my demos. It's honestly, it's a beautiful thing to behold. It's craft of a different nature. There is an art to lens design and optical engineering. The math is well beyond my pay or college degree grade, but I can absolutely respect the results. And this one piece of glass allowed our ultra wide angle lenses to be where they are today. It's pretty darn cool. So the one thing you'll hear a lot about in lenses is the term chromatic aberration. This is the single biggest problem we have. You think the real issue would be just trying to get things sharp. It's actually not terribly difficult to get things sharp. It's just a contrast correction to oversimplify. But it's really hard to get things sharp and to keep light white all the way down to the sensor. There are two types of chromatic aberration. There's longitudinal chromatic aberration, often called loca. If you guys watch any of the DP review or now the petapixel reviews, now that the boys have been sold over to petapixel, you can almost turn a drinking game into how many times Chris says the term loca. It's his favorite. So this is where the rainbow effect takes place across the entire image. If ever you guys have seen like a really strong backlit image of a silhouette and the light is pouring around the branches of your tree, but you see a hard magenta or a hard cyan line around those edges, that's chromatic aberration. Longitudinal is where it happens across the whole frame. Lateral is where it happens from the center outwards. So very lightly, if any, in the center, but harder and harder as we get to the edges. Longitudinal chromatic aberration is a problem for really big front elements. So your favorites like a 135-1.8 or an 85-1.4, 35-1.4, the big super telephoto lenses, anything with those big front elements on the front side, they have the most problem with this situation. The nice part about longitudinal chromatic aberration is it's easily corrected just by stopping down. If you have a 2.8 lens and you stop down to f4, f4.5, your longitudinal chromatic aberration is probably gone by then. It's a nice, easy correction. Lateral chromatic aberration is, generally speaking, a wide angle problem. 24-70s, 24-105s, 24-120s, well known to have this issue. Fisheye lenses, ultra wide lenses, anything where we have a really curved field where I can correct really nicely in the center, but the corrections out towards the corner start to fall off a little bit, especially with the brighter lenses. This becomes a problem. And especially in those 24 to anything zooms where I am starting at a wide angle around 90 degrees, and I'm going into a telephoto vector where I'm trying to flatten an image out, I'm going to end up having some problems in my corners. People ask us all the time why our most innovative lens right now is a 35-150 f2 to 2.8. That focal range is nuts and the aperture range is nuts. But the reason why it works is because it's not a 24 or a 28. If it was, it would be a candy-coated machine in the corners and we wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And so what it does do is it out transmits and it out color corrects in the corners every 24-70 and every 24 to 120 out in the market today. If it was a 24, it'd be just as bad as they are. Now the problem with lateral, you really can't fix it by stopping down. This is one of those vectors that we will give to Adobe or Capture One or Affinity or someone of that nature as a part of the lens profile correction that they'll need to make your lens look good. It's not just to straighten out the image, but also to get rid of the chroma errors that are going to come across. So this is kind of what the graph would look like if we're looking at chromatic aberration. On the left, the perfect lens with no chromatic aberration technically doesn't exist. Chromatic aberration does exist in both visible and invisible. The invisible is always there. Truly, a perfect lens with no chromatic aberration is a toilet paper tube, light just falling through it, no errors because it didn't hit any glass, right? In the middle, the longitudinal, you'll see where that rainbow is spread out across the entire sensor equally. This is nice because I can actually see it and I can even measure for it on MTF charts. And then the lateral here, where it's only happening at the offside, the off center of the sensor, can't measure it, don't know it's there until I take the shot, but at least I can put in a raw corrective value and take care of it from there. These are the two types of groups that'll fix that. So if you ever look at a lens design, you might decide to recognize these, and down the road, you can make yourself an insufferable know-it-all at parties. So on the left, the achromat doublet, you'll recognize this from that Leica lens way back in 1925. Even back then, we had to worry about rainbow issues taking place on film, because film would see it, and we'd have to make sure that we at least corrected it to enough degree that the human eye was very happy. And this is used all over the place. The doublet is very effective. It's very cost effective. It's very easy to produce, and so they're used all over the place. The apochromat triplet is the one that really gets rid of it almost down to a 0 point. And it creates a negligible amount of rainbow effect and really does a nice job. This is a lot more expensive, but is very common in digital lenses because the sensor is so flat, we need to have apochromatic correction. Film being curved, believe it or not, even though you had that pressure plate in the back of your camera, it was always slightly curved, and that actually worked for lens manufacturers. That was something we could prepare for. And so we could cheap out a little bit on the left and give you something like this, and it worked just fine. But digital has no room for error, and the more pixels behind the lens, if you go from 45 to 50 to 60, the more eyeballs you have on all of your errors. Vignetting does get worse. Chromatic aberration does get worse as you move up the resolution line. There's a reason why it's not a bad idea to have a 24 megapixel camera hanging around, and it's because you can buy the cheaper, lighter weight lenses for that and make it your travel camera. The pictures are going to look phenomenal, but if you put those lenses on a 60 megapixel product, they will not. So this is a good example of longitudinal chromatic aberration in full frame. You guys see all that cyan in the back there and all that magenta up front here. So the reason why I chose this particular image is because I know what lens it's from. I will say it's not a Tamron. But I'm not here to pick on this manufacturer. This is a $1,700 35 millimeter 1.4. This is a seriously high-end piece of glass. And you look at that and go, are you serious? Because this thing's got some issues, man. This is not unusual. This is one of those big front element lenses that requires a lot of chroma correction. And shooting it at 1.4, if you have a high contrast image like this, this is what you can expect. We talked about how you can correct it by stopping down, which being someone who purchased a 35 1.4 might seem disappointing because you bought it to be a 1.4. I want to shoot it at 1.4. I don't want these aberrations at 1.4. Well, that's also what raw lens profiles are built for. I can probably put this in Adobe, and I know there's a profile correction for this lens. It's been around for a while, so I can get rid of this pretty well. But this can put people off when they're first looking at it. The reason for this is not to show you necessarily how bad this lens is. In fact, if this manufacturer would hear, they would like you to notice that their corners are really well lit. They have very little, if any, vignetting on this particular lens. Their light transmission from the center to the corner of the image is very good. And then they would also like you to note that the resolution is also very consistent across the frame. So they got good acuity, good micro contrast, good color across the frame, despite the rainbow effect. So they would sit down and go, okay, so we got you the vignetting and we got you the resolution. If we took out the chromatic aberration, which we could, we would also add another £1.5 pounds or possibly 2 pounds to this lens. And we might also add somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 to an already $1,700 product. And we're pretty sure you'd never buy it. And we wouldn't blame you at that point. When a lens starts needing an automated turret just for comfort of use, you have an issue. So this is where you're going to see a lot of lens manufacturers start cutting a little bit of the corner because they know that they can feed this profile to Adobe or Affinity or Capture One, and they know it can be cleaned up quickly. And especially with the AI processing, this is really nothing. But in case you bought this lens and you saw this and you kind of freaked out and want to go back to Mike's camera and yell at your salesperson for selling you a really expensive lead weight, they didn't. It's a great lens. It just requires a little bit more effort from you on the backside. So comparing the two types of chromatic aberration, the one on the left here is lateral. This is a corner crop from a manufacturer's 16 to 35. And so as we move from the center, which is pretty clean, all the way out to the upper left here, we can see that not only do we get some rainbow effect, but we're also getting some veiling, what they call astigmatism. This is a spherical aberration. So this lens has a couple of problems. We actually do have an issue where at wide open, I have my lateral chromatic aberration I'm going to be contending with, but I'm also dealing with spherical aberrations where I just can't seem to get it sharp in the corner at 2.8. Now, if this manufacturer was here, because it is a different one from the other lens, they would like to say, well, how often are you shooting a 16 at 2.8? Aren't you going to shoot that at probably f8, f11? Isn't that an architecture or a landscape lens? Well, if so, then those spherical aberrations will at least go away. It will be sharp in the corners or sharper in the corners, and a lot of that veiling is going to disappear, and the chromatic aberration profile, unfortunately, will stay, but we'll feed that again to Adobe. So once again, putting a little bit more work on you, but also noting that the lens is made more for stopping down than it is for wide open in this particular application. The one on the right here is some really serious longitudinal chromatic aberration. This is another 35-1.4 from another manufacturer, also shot at 1.4, and that's pretty heavy. That's a really tough time with aberration, and I'm pretty certain this is a version 1, not the version 2 of this lens because of that fact. But you can see that magenta veiling is pretty nasty up top here. And that is a thing. At least you can stop this lens down to f2.8, and most of that will have gone away and then fix it again in correction. But just so you guys can see this, these are all very expensive professional grade lenses that have these problems. This is not an 1855 kit. So keep in mind that there will still be times where the lens manufacturer is putting the onus on the photographer to finish the job in post-production.
Question.
Yes.
On post-production like that, to Adobe, is that information include whatever your f-stop was?
Yes.
It does.
Because when you take the photo in the metadata on your camera,
Right.
the lenses, the focal length and the aperture are definitely noted.
So when you feed that information to Adobe, they have it for all the different.
They do their best. Now, Adobe, on the one hand, they're kind of unique. They will sometimes get the profiles from a manufacturer, but other times they will create their own. They'll have a team that goes in and kind of hacks things out, and they come up with a profile, and it works for them. It varies a little bit with the post-production houses. Some of them partner up directly with the manufacturer and just get the actual manufacturer's data, but Adobe will do as Adobe does. So, but either way, yes, they will know what lens you're working with at what focal length, at what aperture ratio. They certainly can see the color vector. They aren't just reading it as just a neutral correction. They do see what's happening there and balance for it. Again, to the best of their ability. Now, in something like this, where this is really bad CA, and I'm quite certain this was shot specifically as an object lesson for a class. By which I mean also, by the way, if you're ever bored, you should go to exposuretherapy.ca. They're very good. But I believe this was shot specifically for class purposes. So this wasn't an image that someone was going to rely on. If they were, they would change their stance. They'd change where they were walking and make sure they had less backlighting in their shot. And since this is direct, by the way, even a polarizer can't fix this. So a big telephoto lens like this 150 to 600. Telephoto lenses in general, they have relatively simple designs. They don't look at large fields of coverage. Their actual job is just to magnify, to kind of bring you closer. And then from there, they need to just keep light, white, and straight. We have a lot of problem with chromatic aberrations. So you'll see low dispersion elements often working in twofold because one just wasn't enough. It meant that it hit the first element on the left there, hit the second element, which was LD, got partially corrected, hit the third, and is mostly corrected. This guy is here because the stabilization unit is right here. So one of the problems with optical stabilization is that it is moving a piece of glass around the center. It is not always centered because you are not always centered. You're a highly caffeinated individual with the jitters. So its job is to try and zig when you zag, but if I'm decentering my element, I am going to create more aberrations by doing so. And so we automatically make sure that we have an LD element in the back to cover for that stabilization unit's slight problems. It's worth it. It's an extra piece of glass that we wouldn't need if we didn't have a stabilization unit. But I think we can all agree at 600 millimeter, we absolutely demand stabilization these days, since it's available. This is that innovative lens we talked about previously. This is an extraordinarily complex design, the 35 to 150 f2 to 2.8. So I have a massive zoom range that starts at wide angle, and I have an f2 beginning aperture ratio. This is a lot of correction. The craziest thing about this lens isn't its resolution. It's the fact that throughout its focal range at wide open, there's no hint of visible chromatic aberration. We did a great job. 2.5 pounds. It's about the weight of a good ultra wide or slightly less than a 70 to 200 2.8. But I mean, it's dense. I'm not going to lie. I carry it with me everywhere. And the forearms are good. So one thing to see here is you see this big group here. This is our apochromat triplet. This right here is probably $500 of the lens by itself. This is where a lot of that chroma correction is taking place. It looks like that's a lot of space between two elements. No, that is a really thick piece of glass right there, doing all, not just spherical correction, but also chroma correction. And then we also have a doublet up front here. There's another two pieces. And then of course we have 1, 2, and 3 LD elements right in the front. So we know that where light is up at the front of this lens, it's rainbows galore. And as we hit to the back, we get rid of those rainbows by focusing light back to where it's supposed to go. And then this is an APS-C lens, a little ultra wide, 11 to 20. It's a brilliant little lens, and it is absolutely tiny. And because it's tiny and it's a little complex, this is where you'll see the first XLD elements. So this is where we're really showcasing the fact that this lens wanted to be small and lightweight. It's built for the videographer. It wants to be on a gimbal. It wants to be handheld and not on a tripod. And to do that, we had to use some pretty impressive pieces of glass. This is also another really good example that a single element can be a group, because you see it says 12 elements in 10 groups. Well, I have this group of 2, this group of 2, and then every other element here is a single group of its own. Each one has a very important corrective job on its own. And it does do a very nice job. And she is tiny. So it's a lot of fun to work with in video. Whenever people ask me, so how many elements does it have? My answer is however many it took to make it. Because honestly, unless there's just an extraordinary amount, there was one lens that's now been replaced, so I'll bring it up by brand. It was the original 70 to 200 2.8 G Master from Sony. And that lens was over-engineered. It was clearly made by someone who was on a deadline, scared of their boss, and heavy on Adderall. It was 32 pieces of glass under the hood. It was a lot of glass, which meant that it was really dense and it was not a bright lens. It had a lot of issues because it was designed to have really pretty circular bokeh balls around the back. And they did have those, but it also lost almost everywhere else. So that's one of the few times when having too many elements can cause a problem. But in reality, it really is just whatever made the lens go. Any questions so far? Are we doing good? Is there any questions in the chat that we know of? Cool. Yes, that was over 3 pounds. Yep. The new one, on the other hand, is a marvel of engineering. So focal length, why is this in here when I'm in a room full of people who've been shooting half their lives? It's because most people don't actually know what focal length is, and there's a lot of misinformation around it. It is, in fact, a linear measurement, 50 millimeter. The way it's measured is the same on a medium format camera as it is on a point and shoot camera. Focal length is the optical center of the plane. It's optical center of the lens. Its distance from the film plane or the sensor when the lens is focused to infinity. That's it. So I'm focused all the way out to infinity, and the optical center of my lens is 50 millimeters away from the sensor. I have a 50 millimeter lens. That's how it's done. And that's traditionally how lenses are measured when there aren't tricks of the trade up our sleeves. So that is something that we would say 50 millimeters is a 50 millimeters is a 50 millimeter. There are no standard angles of coverage. Angles of coverage are often dictated by the format. A 50 millimeter lens on a medium format has a larger surface area. It automatically has a wider field of coverage. We all know a 50 millimeter lens on a micro four thirds sensor, that sensor being super tiny, we know it's a double crop over 35 millimeter. It's a smaller field of coverage. It's not a magnification. There is no magnification effect to smaller sensors. It's just that your subject takes up more space on that smaller sensor. It's like looking through a Vegas peephole instead of a bay window. That's all it is. So this is provided by our friends at Fuji. This is an 8 to 16 millimeter lens, so it's a very wide angle piece of glass. So when it's looking out at infinity, in this case represented by that tree, its optical center is 8 millimeters away from the sensor. And when it's at 8 millimeters. When I zoom out to 16, the optical center of the lens will be 16 millimeters away from the sensor. This type of measurement is called long focal length or true focal length. And the reason why I have to bring up those phrases is that because today people want really big lenses that don't weigh a lot and are somehow small. They want big and small. And so we've had to come up with ways to lie to you. So this just basically showcases the crop. So these are the three major sensor formats currently in use today, with the full frame being the largest, the APS-C or crop sensor as people tend to call it, and then our friends at Micro Four Thirds and Panasonic OM Digital Solutions being the smallest sensor. If I have this image of this barred owl and I'm looking at it through a full frame camera, I see it as this. But if I put the smaller sensors on, I'm still using the same lens. The crop sensor sees just this amount, and the Micro Four Thirds sensor sees just this amount. My magnification has not changed. My hyperfocal distance has not changed. Just the amount of surface area that the lens cover has changed. So how are we faking you out? Well, this is one way to do it. So you might have heard of Canon's diffractive optics or Nikon's new phase Fresnel lenses, the PF glass that have been making waves out there, the 300, 500, 800 that they can't seem to make enough of. This is one way to cheat you into getting you the magnification of a 300, 500, or an 800 without giving you the actual focal length of a 300, 500, or 800. The photo industry is pretty lax. We can actually put equivalencies on the lens barrel if we want to. And in this case, working with PF optics or DO optics, I can intensify, concentrate, and spread light so I can get you the magnification value of a 500 millimeter lens without giving you a 500 millimeter lens. This is not dissimilar to how teleconverters work. Oftentimes, telephoto lenses are a 100 or 200 millimeter design with a group of elements in the back that act like a teleconverter normally would. It just takes the core image and spreads it, just like you would by pulling a magnifying lens away from your face, and it spreads the image out, and suddenly it looks magnified because it is, but it's not truly a long 400 or a long 800 millimeter. And nor should we care, to be quite honest with you. I realize that I'm sort of doing a little bit of behind the class talk that could get me in trouble with a few manufacturers. But in reality, if you're getting that magnification vector and a lens that's 3 pounds instead of 7 and is $4,500 instead of $12,000, I believe we can all agree to be pretty cool with that. Is it going to have the same hyperfocal compression as a long 800? No. Is it going to have the same true magnification of a long 800? Not quite, but it won't matter because we don't know. I can't show you that $14,000 800 side by side with this $4,500 800. You're getting the magnification you've never seen before on any other lens in your lineup. You should be good to go. It's not a problem. The reason why these lenses have had issues is probably because these elements, as awesome as they are, can be very fragile, and I'm sure that they have some losses in production. This is one of those lenses that they do put a fairly rigid outer shell to, because if it takes a solid impact, it can shatter. Its downfall, it can have some issues with chromatic aberration. We are bending light all over the place inside this one piece of glass. And we can have some interesting concentric circles in our out of focus highlights from time to time, depending on how light is hitting us in the barrel. But those are honestly small compromises in the greater aspect of being able to shoot an 800 millimeter lens that weighs less than 5 pounds. So now we've got our color problem and our magnification problem out of the way. We got to look at light transmission. And this is where you find out that an f2.8 and an f2.8 and an f2.8 are not the same as far as light transmission goes. The aperture ratio is the same. The size of the hole in the back of the lens is the same, but the amount of light falling through it is different. And that can be affected by the amount of elements, yes, but it is typically affected by the type of coatings placed inside the lens and on each element. In this particular comparison, we have 270 to 200 2/8, both considered top of their game. They're outstanding lenses. One of them is a half stop brighter than the other. Doesn't matter. At every focal length, at every aperture ratio, and it's because the coatings on the elements on one of those lenses do a better job of allowing light to fall through the barrel. That's it. Now, it doesn't sound like much, a half stop, but if you're a concert photographer, someone who shoots dance troupe and theater, that extra half stop is everything. Any amount of extra shutter speed or handhold ability that I can get, or more light to my autofocus system so it tracks better, or more light to my sensor so I get less noise, I get less resistance, that extra half stop can go a long way for me. So that's where we talk about the multi-coated optics. So we generally have two types. We have the broadband AR, the anti-reflection coatings, and then we have what is commonly referred to as nano coatings, the extended bandwidth coatings in the bottom there. So the first one that we're looking for, the anti-reflection coatings, are simply about allowing light to fall through a lens. When I talk about glass that has a high refractive index, that's a piece of glass that lets a lot of light through it. And the best, highest refractive index glass out there, we could put into our hands and it almost disappears. You almost cannot see it. It's really amazing. 99.98% light fall through. It looks like you're holding air. It's really cool stuff. The interesting aspect of higher refractive index glass is that it's also very dense, and it's because it has the fewest amount of impurities. And so it takes longer to cool. It can take up to 2 years for a single element to cool in the chamber, waiting for it to get mold and pressed. But once it does, it is well worth your time. And that's why those lenses tend to be more costly, because just the amount of time and effort it takes to make that glass. But yeah, we can get you down to as little as 0.05% light loss, which is outrageous. Nano coating is here to take care of internal problems. We have all these pieces of glass inside the lens. Why don't I have a whole bunch of light just bouncing around in there like a pinball between these pieces of glass? And it's because I have my bandwidth coatings on each element to a certain degree. I've actually had customers come up to me and put their lens on the counter and go, "This lens can't be any good. The coatings on the front aren't the right color." I don't know what to say to that half the time. It's not the right shade of green or bluish purple or what have you, but they are coated to the best of the lens manufacturer's ability, given the cost that you both are willing to share out of the deal. But they are at least trying to get rid of internal coatings. When digital first started getting really big, one of the major complaints that everybody had was there was so much flare happening and nobody could really figure it out. And as people started doing research, Canon and Olympus most specifically did a really good job on this. Canon figured out that the sensors were causing a part of the problem. The light was bouncing off the piece of glass called the sensor and trying to go back up through the lens. Well, the elements weren't coated for reverse transmission. So it hit the first rear element group and it just scattered everywhere. And suddenly all of our contrast was gone. Tons of sensor flare. And Olympus discovered that filters sucked. And suddenly people had to stop buying Moose Peterson filters that had no UV and AR coatings on both sides. You had to buy the real thing. And so MRC and Nano and HGX and all these other crazy filters started popping up, partly because, yes, we are always trying to take your money in the photo industry, but also because you do need them. If you have a really expensive piece of glass and you think, I just need a UV filter to protect the front end, and you buy a low-end UV filter, you just replaced your high-end front element with a really low-end cheapy plate glass front element. And I cannot tell you how terrible it makes your images. I fix more bad lenses by taking off bad filters. As a lens manufacturer, we have a strong disagreement with the free filter packs that are given away online, because they should be free. And then you should take them home, drill a hole through them, and hang them up as a mobile, because that's what they're good for. Or use them as coasters. That's about as good as they are, optically speaking. And so they're not really doing you favors. They're getting rid of filters they probably had since the 90s. Absolutely.
So I'd heard that a lot of the newer digital cameras have an IR filter or UV filter on the lens, on the sensor.
There is.
And you don't need necessarily a UV filter on the lens.
That is incorrect.
Okay.
So the low pass or IR filters are there to help with infrared blooming, and that is true. And low pass filters also deal with an aliasing problem, where if I will often have doubling of lines between pixels, and an anti-alias filter slightly softens that effect, and then I can go in and sharpen it afterwards, or it's sharpened in the algorithm on the camera. Today's sensors, you'll see a lot of them say that the anti-alias filter has been removed or the low pass filter has been removed. And that's because the distance between pixels is shrinking at all times. And in some cases on sensors, there is no distance. The pixels are smack right next to each other. I don't have to worry about information loss between the pixels. It's interesting to think about it in terms of how small pixels are. But if I have a gap between two light wells, that is a gap where there's no information. I'm not getting the information from that image in front of me into that gap. Nothing exists there. It's like shooting through a screen door. That checkerboard would always be there. The camera is interpolating and putting data where there isn't any to finish the shot. I would rather have a sensor where all of my pixels are stacked side by side. That way I don't have to worry about the lattice effort. I don't have to interpolate my file. But there are some sensors, I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but there are some sensors where they split their pixel into image gathering and also a portion of the pixel into the autofocus session. Canon's dual pixel autofocus is a really good example of that. This is great. This means that my actual light gathering pixels are also my eyeballs for autofocus, and it can make for some unbelievable tracking capacity. It's amazing what they can see. The downfall of it, though, is that does mean my pixels are smaller, and because the autofocus is separating my core pixel from another core pixel, I do have to interpolate the lost data. And so the downfall of having dual pixel or a focus system like that is that I'll often lose a little bit of contrast, I'll lose sensitivity, or I'll lose dynamic range, or all three, depending on what it's being fed. So, but there's always going to be some give and take in the architecture, but it's true that sensors are somewhat corrected for UV and infrared because you don't want those light spectrums coming in and interfering with your average everyday photography, which is why you might have an old SLR in your house you want to go get converted. You know, you'll send it off to Pixela or whoever, and they'll strip it of all of those corrective values, and you'll get a full spectrum sensor or just infrared, and they'll be able to take care of that for you. A UV filter, though, on the front end of a lens still takes care of a problem we do have with CMOS sensors at higher altitudes, where they do see UV as a muddying effect. There is still a UV haze problem above 6,500 feet, so especially our photography can be heavily affected by it. Someone down on the beaches of Florida may be less so. They'll have to deal with the inversion problems at sea level, but we'll have an issue where you'll look at the shade and it just looks mottled and muddy, and there's less detail than you would normally see. A proper UV filter will help clear that up. A proper UV filter does have UV coatings on the front and does have UV coatings on the back. There are a lot of UV filters that have none of that and are just plate glass, and they call themselves UV, and there's a reason why they're $10 versus the other one being $80.
For the UV, the glass blocks UV.
No, it blocks white light. It does not necessarily block UV transmission.
So is there, I guess, neutral, is there recommended brands that you would suggest for?
There's more coating types. Like you want somebody that is multi-coated. They'll often use the term MRC for front and back. Nano is the same type of thing where it's multi-coated front and back. Anything that's actually the type of glass that I would recommend looking for. There's a type of filter glass called Shot B270, and they'll tell you if they're shot glass or if they're B270 glass, usually on their packaging. It's a specific formula of glass that allows for really high light transmission. It's a very high refractive index for a filter. You want to buy a filter that's as good or better than the front element of your lens. Otherwise, it just gets in the way. And it's true, a good UV will run $60 to $130 depending on its size. So I know it sucks. Polarizers, sky's the limit on polarizers and neutral density filters. Right. If you are a long exposure junkie, you need to buy the neutral density filter that has the IR coatings, because sensors, the longer they expose, the more the IR light spectrum creeps in, and you get weird blooming effects. So a proper neutral density filter for long exposure values will have the IR blocking, and it will say that on their packaging as well. A variable neutral density people use for filming and for video is great for light blocking for video purposes, but they're not good for long exposure purposes. This is real pieces of glass. I love this shot. This was taken at our Japanese plant, and it's one of my favorites. It looks fake. It looks CGI. And it's one of my favorite things where you've got the molded glass A-spheres, the spheres, and these massive front elements for some of the larger telephoto lenses. Fantastic stuff. So a good example, this is just an illustration showing what happens when you have regular coatings versus the E-band broadband coating set. So conventional coating is a highly reflective surface. So white light goes in and tries to follow through, but most of it is reflected off the surface. Reflected light is lost light. Reflected light is lost contrast. Reflected light is lost resolution. I want as much light transmission as possible for all of those reasons. So a nano coat will allow more light to travel through. It's just how it goes. If you're ever at Mike's camera, they've got they have these black pads, and it's great. Since they carry a bunch of different levels of filters, it's nice. Tell them to bring out their HDX, the top of the line, the best filter they sell, and it's a very good filter. Put it down on that black pad, and then tell them to bring out their cheap UV and put them side by side, and the difference will be immediately apparent. The HDX filter will look like there's no glass involved. It'll just look like you're looking at a ring, and it just fell through air to the table. The standard UV is going to look gray, and all you'll see is your reflection, the reflection of the lights in the room, and everything else. And now you'll know one of those is not feeding your lens and sensor, and the other definitely is. And all the best polarizers will have the same coatings. So this is another good example. So this is 2 pieces of glass. You can't see the second one, but one is coated and one is non-coated. It's fantastic. This was also stolen along with my A-sphere, unfortunately. So this is, oh yeah, in Salt Lake City, no less. Would you believe? About 45 minutes after this shot was taken. So I'm glad I got this image though. So this element on the right here is a spherical element with no optical coatings whatsoever. And so what happens is light gets trapped between the edges of the spherical object. So it hits the front element, goes in, hits the back, and it just kind of refracts inside the sphere, and it looks like it just fills up with light like a marshmallow. On the left, that's what broadband nanocoating will do. Light just falls through, and you don't even know that a piece of glass identical to the one to the right is there, just coated. So when you get a really nice piece of coating work and you get all your color and your focusing aberrations all taken care of, you can point a lens almost directly into the sun and still have about 90% or more of the dynamic range of your sensor available to you. So in here, we're working out in, this is Monument Valley. This is phenomenal dynamic range. And this is on an older sensor. You'll even get better dynamic range today. But I am pointing the lens directly into that sun, and we deliberately pulled the shadows and to show you what we still were able to resolve. And it was an amazing amount of detail. Better coatings also make for better sun stars. So if you've got a lens that excels at sun stars, this will help you. And better coatings will harden up those edges a bit and give you better contrast. And still, as you see, I am now looking directly into the sun, and I still have an awful lot of information in and around the subject here. Now, a funny thing about this particular shot, this was for a generation 1 lens that we had. This was for our original 15 to 32.8. And I built the very first version of this project back then. And I used this image because I was making fun of us, because down here, we've got some chroma, we've got some issues with flare. We're not doing this right. So I sent this slide in as a joke to my executive VP of operations, who, unbeknownst to me, sent it to Japan with my remarks, my flippant remarks, I might add. And about 6 months later, apparently probably already on the slate, our 15 to 32.8 generation 2 was announced. And I got an email from Japan with a single line that said the problem has been mitigated. Makes you wonder, poking the bear is a good or bad idea. How well was it mitigated, though? Holy crap. Really, really, really well. So what they did is they invented an entirely new way of coating your favorite expanded glass mold lenses. So one of the problems with ultra wide lenses, we figured out how to get the curvature done, that really wicked single piece of glass that saved us for ultra wide. The problem was we still didn't figure out how to coat it well. We always had great coatings in the center, but it always fell off to the corners, and we had a lot of issues with that. Well, we figured out an entirely new way of coating curved optics so that the coating is completely equivalent across the board. On the center to the corner of the frame, the coating is exact. And they did it specifically, I like to think, just to get under my skin. So if a lens is doing its job in focus, I have no aberrations, I've got great lighting from corner to corner, my out of focus highlights are nice and smooth, I don't have any purple, green, cyan, or otherwise fringing, and it's focused and resolving exactly where I told it to focus and resolve. It's the way I would like it to go. So what else would matter from this point? Well, I got to fix the human problem. And the human problem is usually caffeination or something of the similar, maybe lack of sleep. But the fact remains that stabilization is one of the great inventions of the modern era. And there are two kinds of stabilization for in lens, and it's good for you to know about them because it may explain some of the behaviors of some of your lenses if you didn't already understand it. The first one is biaxial. We call it the Holy Cross because it blesses you up and down and it blesses you left and right, but it cannot bless you in any other direction. So if you are one of those photographers who likes a 45-degree Dutch angle, it does not understand the 45-degree Dutch angle, and it will jump all over the place and will possibly ruin your image because it doesn't know how to do diagonals. And so in some cases, it is better to turn your stabilization off. And in the case of biaxial, anything but true horizontal or true vertical. The triaxial stabilization, which is the one that is used in all high-end and professional glass, and is in fact the Tamron invention, I should note, is the king. It is able to float in nearly 360 degrees. It's basically 359.95 degrees. And it does so on electromagnetics, 3 different magnetic coils in open space. It zigs when you zag. It is constantly moving. If you ever wonder why your instructors always tell you to turn your stabilization off when it's on a tripod, it's because your stabilizer by trade has to always be moving. It has a fixed megahertz ratio of movement. When you interrupt it, it measures your interruption and it counteracts that interruption. And that's how it knows what it's doing. So when it sits on a tripod, it doesn't know that the world has stopped. It's still in there, spiraling around, waiting for you to do your thing. And the longer you expose, the longer your image is blurred. It's a nice softening effect. It's a free effect. We give it to you. So remember to turn it off when you're on a tripod. It's true. That is the case for lenses. I don't care if it's mirrorless or DSLR. That is still the case today. It is a lens baby effect across the whole frame.
So with some of the mirrorless body stabilization,
Yes.
is that an issue with that? Then
It is not. They will actually combine.
Okay.
Sensor is being moved, the lens is being moved, and they will typically sync up and take care of each other. So really good optical correction is 5.5 stops. A sensor can add 2, even 3 stops on top of that, depending on how well those pieces know each other. There's a little bit of hyperbole out there right now. It might surprise you that the photo industry has a marketing habit, but it's still really freaking amazing, and you should try it. Absolutely. And it's true. This is actually one of the benefits of the smaller sensors, like the Micro Four Thirds. They can move around large image circles and still keep a sharp image. And since they're so tiny, they can move around twice the space. So you can handhold a Micro Four Thirds sensor even better than you can a full frame sensor.
I do too.
It's
yeah.
No, it happens.
Yeah.
So are you saying that I just softens the image on a tripod?
Yes. They do not
There's no
know
way
you.
to turn.
Yes, there is. Absolutely. There's always a stabilization off mode in the camera. Or if you have a lens and a body, if the lens has an IS switch on it, it will control the body. So if you switch it off on the lens, the body is off. If you switch on the lens, the body is on. It's an all or nothing proposition. You wouldn't want the lens to not be working and the body to be working. That just doesn't make any sense.
How to stabilize lens. Can turn it off.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Because like if I'm using the Nikon Z series cameras,
Yep.
and the lens that's on there doesn't have image stabilization,
But the body does.
but the body does. But I to Dave's point, I don't know that there's a feature in there to.
Turn it off.
The VR is
In the body, at least on a Canon, without a lens that you can turn it off. Because the body, there's no menu in the body to turn off.
there is. It's an addition you can make and add to your quadrant screen. And that kind of the same thing where you can put the VR into your Q screen.
Okay.
And you can do it and it's just an off on.
Yeah, if you go to the I menu in Nikon, you can
Yeah.
have the VR,
Okay.
you can turn it off and on from there.
You're
Canon is
probably
similar.
right. Yeah, I just haven't.
Similar situation.
Okay.
Yeah, IS always has an on-off protocol because outside of camcorders, the stabilization units don't know whether or not it's completely still. They don't understand it. I do want to note this is more to the reviewers that you guys possibly follow on YouTube. There are a few of them that I would occasionally like to jump through the screen and strangle for half a moment. It's that they're constantly reviewing stabilization. I don't care the company; they're doing it incorrectly. It's there to assist with your shakiness. I'm a highly caffeinated individual. I'm literally drinking a Monster while we're doing this. Let's go. And in the end, when I shoot, I will probably need some stabilization to assist me. However, because I handhold differently from another individual who handholds differently from another individual. The corrective value is given for marketing purposes as if the camera is basically being measured in a vise. It is being measured on a machine how good the stabilization can be. That's why they'll say up to 5 stops. However, if there's an individual that is shaky at 1/1000th of a second, there's only so much correction that lens can give them. It's still better than 0, but it is not going to go all the way up to the 5 stops for that individual. The best stabilization correction really does take a little bit of time, where you do kind of have to go into sniper mode, control your breathing, pause, pre-focus, settle. And as you settle, you'll notice the lens go from moving around a little bit to it looks like it's not moving at all. And at that point, it's got you nailed. Then you take your shot. The best stabilization takes a moment for everything to come into play. A little bit is nice if you're just moving around, shooting birds in flight, doing whatever. It does help you. There's no question about it. But if you want the best there is, you have to give it a pause to get to the point where it can be the best that it has.
So I have a question.
Yes.
My biggest problem is forgetting to turn it off when I take the lens off.
So it doesn't hurt the lens. I do want to express that. What it does is it doesn't seat the stabilization group, so they are loose in the magnetic coils at that point. So if you look through the lens and just kind of vibrate a little bit, you'll see them shaking in the back. It's not the best, because if you have someone who's like, gosh, Dave, this lens is looking like it's vibrating. Yes, first punch that guy and take your lens back. But secondly, it can over long periods cause issues. But if it's just running around in your backpack every once in a while like that, it's not going to be a problem. I always forget to turn off my stabilization units, always. And I put hours and hours through my lenses every week, let alone over a given year. I can't tell you how abused my gear is. It's unbelievable. And I've never had that problem. But you do bring up a really good point, and that is both autofocus motors and stabilization units are mechanical creatures, and they do have an overall lifespan of use before they do wear down. So we don't even think about it like that. We're like, our lens is just always going to be there for us, like our best friend or our dog. But eventually an autofocus unit will fall out of calibration, and a stabilization unit will fall out of calibration. And that's a point where you decide, is it worth the repair? If it's us and it's still within our 6-year warranty, you send it to us, we'll just take care of it for free. It's part of what we do. But it's something to consider as you move down the line. Your camera's behavior will slightly change over 5 years, because heat and cold will change the shape and value of your autofocus matrix, and your lenses will change over 2-3 years also. That's just breaking in of a product. It's just how it goes. So a little bit of maintenance is not a bad thing. Just for educational purposes, this is what different stabilization units look like. They are built for the lenses they are going in. They are not some universal build that we share from lens to lens to lens. And obviously a $200 lens is not going to get the same stabilization unit that we're going to put into a $2,000 lens. It's just not how things work. But as is the case, typically a little is better than none. And this is where it's broken down. This is a single element group where inside the stabilization unit, but we've got our 3 magnets here, and these are the guys that will float this element, and this element is going to be controlled by its own brain. The best autofocus lenses with stabilization units have 2 brains. They'll have a brain specifically for autofocus, and they'll have a brain specifically for stabilization, so that they are not interfering with each other. And that way, being independent, they can make their own decisions, and they do work better because of it. So on your lenses, you'll have different modes. And the first 2 modes here are universal, actually. Any lens in the industry, Nikon, Canon, us, Sony, Fuji, if you have a mode 1 and a mode 2, they are going to be the same. General purpose is the one you probably leave it on 90% of the time. It's you walking around shooting a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You look through the viewfinder, you can see it stabilizing you. It helps relax the eye. It's great. If though you are the type of birder who likes to drag the shutter while panning, and you want that lateral blurred background to show that power of movement, or shooting F1 racing or anything that is high speed, and you want to really give that feel of motion, then mode 2 is where it's at. This is specifically built to help you stabilize for panning purposes. It stops fighting you from left to right, and it really stabilizes up and down and allows that lateral movement to look really good. It looks like you just locked your hips and moved in parallel, and it makes you look like an amazing photographer. It's fantastic. The problem with the panning mode is it's only good at panning, and it should be turned off when you're not panning because it can ruin other types of photography due to its whacked out correction values. So it's something to consider. If you are suddenly getting blurry images and you don't know why and everything else is good, check your lens to make sure you're not in mode 2. Mode 3 is a newer value, and it is it was shared on DSLR by Tamron and a couple of the Sony lenses. This is what we call capture priority. This is the best possible stabilization a lens can give you, but is built specifically for static objects, where panning is for movement, capture priority is for an owl in a tree that's not going anywhere, the moose in the river that's not going anywhere. The only bad part about this stabilization, aside from the fact that it's not good for sports movement, is that you can't see it. In the viewfinder, you're going to be as shaky as you ever are, but when you hit the shutter, it has already done all the measurement, and it's going to give the stabilization the strongest power vector that it can, and it will give you up to an extra stop of stabilization for still photography, and it does an outstanding job. And then now that we have video, we have to consider the video user as well. So now we have new stabilization modes coming in. Viewfinder priority is what led to AI. These two are actually kind of linked to the hip. Viewfinder priority stabilization was usually something that you had to program through a dock. This was not actually something available in first-party lenses. This was only available via third-party lenses that could use a dock for updating and for programmability. So believe it or not, this is actually one of the areas where third party had an advantage, and that we could create a lens that was good at stabilization, but also have an unlockable stabilization mode for videographers. Then Tamron took it to the next level with AI, because why not? We do want to note that our AI was out before ChatGPT, so we own the patent as far as we're concerned. But what this is leading towards the stabilization unit that will eventually know the difference between on a tripod, standing still, walking, or running. There will come a point when I believe, this is not Tamron speaking, this is me, this is just logical architecture, there will come a point where the stabilizer understands that you're on a tripod, and it will turn itself off. But for now, we are getting close. So in this case, the AI actually has a multiprocessor on board that understands the different values between standing still, walking, and running while videographing. So I can actually pick up, and especially in higher frame rates for those people doing slow-mo, it can make a huge difference. It's not a replacement for a gimbal yet. Gimbals are still the best there is for video motion. But if you're on a budget and you got to work with what you have, this will do better than any other stabilization type for these lenses. You will note that we are cheating because it's only in 2 lenses right now. It's that new of an architecture, and it's only for the smaller sensor type, because smaller sensors are easier to stabilize. So we are scaling the tech, but it is really good on those smaller sensors. So if you are working with a Sony crop sensor or a Fuji X series, or that wicked little Sony Cinema Cam, the FX30, these are lenses that should be under the hood. Oh, so how good is that viewfinder capture? It's really, really good. That's interesting. Cool, there we go. So this shot is at 10 feet off of Bubba here, the owl, at 600 millimeter at 1/30th of a second. And I can get an 80% capture ratio with that. That's wicked. Or sometimes you work in absolutely horrific lighting and you have no choice, and you have to drop your shutter speeds to ridiculous levels to get your shot. This was a torture test put upon the Sigma rep and myself in Arizona. The PPA organization of Phoenix forced us to do a shootout. We had no choice. It's not something we normally do. We're buddies, we're pals. The idea is that we're here for friendly competition, but the room wanted to see who had the better stabilization unit. This is on a crop sensor camera. So on a crop sensor camera, DSLR, of course, no in-body stabilization whatsoever. And therefore, my field being narrowed, this was a 200 millimeter shot. Therefore, it's a 300 millimeter equivalent field of coverage stabilized. This is 1/6 of a second handheld. That is at 2.8 also. So that's the worst that this lens does. We This was on a Canon 80D. We make the best 7200 2.8 for Canon DSLR users, end of story. But what about something like, because that's a torture test, we're trying not to do those things to ourselves as photographers. We have enough problems in our lives. But what about real world settings? Well, you think at 70 mil, I can hand hold 1/50th of a second. Well, actually, most people really can't. So just walking around doing regular shooting in regular light, 1/50th of a second at 70, the stabilization unit here really allowed us to do our trick. And the other lens, which didn't have stabilization at all, is not able to do this. So with mirrorless advent, the stabilization equation is no longer, it's moot. Most cameras have it. So now you don't have to worry about it so much. But in DSLRs, it's still a very big part of your purchasing conundrum. If you can afford it, you should get stabilization. So
Before you do that, what's on burst modes for stabilization? How much is that slowing down your frames per second?
it's generally not too much. Nothing noticeable. For most cameras, it'll be a buffer problem before it's a stabilization problem. So it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Stabilization isn't pulling so much power away from the camera that it's slowing things down overall. If anything, transfer of autofocus point, if you have a large group working, a camera's decision making to go from one point to the next, from low contrast to high contrast, if you are not working in a stable environment, that will slow things down more than a stabilization unit will. And especially with in-body stabilization, since all your pixels are in motion at all times, it doesn't even bother. It's just not even a part of the equation. It's either on or off as far as the camera's concerned. So autofocus, this is where the lens has to work with you to spool up, acquire the subject, track it, and then stop when it's told to stop. So it's sharpen and focus. The top one there is the best autofocus units for DSLRs. So we don't have to worry about these as much, but it's fun to note that for those of you who are switching to mirrorless or have switched to mirrorless, might still have an adapter for some of your older lenses. This autofocus motor type was outstanding on DSLR, and because mirrorless autofocus architecture is even better, it only improves the lens further. You actually get better performance out of DSLR lenses with good autofocus motors on mirrorless than you do on DSLRs. So it's really nice to note that adaptation is actually not a bad thing. You'll get the best that lens can handle simply because mirrorless will give it to you. So if you have a ring type autofocus motor, and here I put almost everybody's abbreviations on there, USD, USM, AFS, HSM, SSM, it's all the same type of technology. If there's one thing that camera manufacturers and lens manufacturers try to do, is feed you a series of acronyms that make you feel special, like you belong to a tribe, when in fact it's all the same thing. We're not supposed to tell you that, of course. I'm like a pariah sometimes. I get lots of interesting DMs from other people around the industry, but this is true. It's all the same type of architecture. Even the communication type is basically the same. So, but what you do need to know is that it's the best there is for autofocus DSLRs. And if you have this acronym on your lens, you're probably doing pretty well. There are a couple companies that unfortunately they do skate a little on thin ice, where they will use a similar autofocus motor with similar technology, but put it into their $200 lenses, and because it's close enough to the architecture, they will use this acronym. But you can tell, just like they won't put a good stabilization unit in that $200 lens, they're definitely not putting the same autofocus motor in that $200 lens that they do in their $5,000 telephoto. I think that's very clear. But it is of similar architecture. So it's still better than an older autofocus motor type. In mirrorless, we have the same problem. We all have different acronyms, but it's all the same stuff. You'll see RxD, STM, Nano, USM, or linear as a really good example. And that is all a form of stepper type motor. One of the things about autofocus in DSLRs is that it was done in rotations. Your autofocus motor would rotate and basically corkscrew a lens front and back. Whereas on mirrorless lenses, it is done in linear steps, perpendicular from the sensor, very much on rails. It looks kind of like a bellows that's been trimmed down and stuck inside a camera. The difference between number 2 and number 3, they're actually of similar design. Number 3 is just scaled up and is much stronger, much more powerful because it's designed to deal with really heavy glass. you'll see the dual linear motors in big telephoto lenses where they have to work large elements with a lot of torque and still move them even faster than the smaller lenses can. What's really fun is when they stick one of number 3 motors into a really tiny lens and it just never stops autofocusing accurately. The way that that little thing will pick up is outrageous. You'll see those, you'll always know a lens is really built for vlogging and video when it's super tiny, but it gets this absolutely overperforming autofocus motor underneath the hood. It's awesome. This is what a ring type looks like when you slice your lens in half, except for the autofocus side of things. And hopefully this will translate for folks because this is worth watching. So this is old enough that it uses our old logo, but it is in fact what a ring type autofocus motor looks like in action. So you guys recognize that window, the old hunt and move? Do love old CAD graphics. So in the days of SLR, this was super efficient movement, super silent, super accurate, and really good for a lot of different purposes of autofocus. And its benefit was that if you had a minimum autofocus distance of say 1.5 feet at your wide angle on your zoom, you got to keep that same autofocus distance at your telephoto side as well. And so that allowed you to literally be 1.5 feet off at wide angle, zoom in all the way to the end of your telephoto and still be in focus. That was the benefit of this type of autofocus motor. Bruce and I think it was you and I that were talking earlier about how some mirrorless lenses don't like to focus while you're zooming.
Yeah.
It's actually a part of the compromise in linear motors is that occasionally you'll have more than one piece of glass on the motor, and as you zoom, that piece of glass has to reseat itself and it has to stop and think about what it's doing while you're zooming. And this is a video of that type of design. So this is one of the dual linear motors. This is very common in high-level professional lenses today. So you'll see there's 2 pieces of glass being moved. So each piece of glass moves only half the distance, and it moves far less distance than something that needs to rotate. If you want to know why mirrorless lenses focus so much faster with so much more precision, is because they do it at like a quarter of the efficiency required for DSLR. It's amazing stuff.
That's the benefit of the magnets, is that right?
Yes. So with this motor, if we were just to drop this down to a single element, it would be a stepper unit, basically. So it would be just the smaller version with less torque. But in any case, it's still, because it's moving in straight lines, it moves far less distance than something that's to rotate 360 degrees. It's always faster.
So we use that, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. That's what we're here for.
How does it move in a linear fashion? And then you relate that to throw on the outside of the barrel.
So just because lens design demands that we have to, if we use the old push-pull design of like the old 200 to 400s or 100 to 400s, we used to call those dust pumps for a reason. They're vacuum lenses. Anytime I move a lens in and out like that with the barrel movement, it just sucks everything in it. It doesn't matter how gasketed or sealed it is, dust is going to get in there. And so while it makes for really quick zoom design, it's nice for that. It's terrible for longevity on the zoom.
I'm talking about zoom, I'm talking about actual focus.
So that's the fun part. So when you're focusing a mirrorless lens, it is what they call by wire. It actually changes the speed at which it moves the rails at the speed at which you rotate that ring. It's not actually mechanically linked at all. It is an electronic measurement. And so that's why if you rotate really slow, it will really crawl. If you rotate it really fast, it will jump ahead. For mirrorless lenses with by-wire focusing, there's no consistent amount of turn between minimum object distance and infinity. And this is actually one of the complaints from the videographers who need the exact same amount of turn every single time from minimum object distance to infinity. And we'll get involved with that in a little bit later. But it's one of those things where on mirrorless lenses, it is, as you spin it, it's actually an electronic signal that's moving the actuator. It doesn't actually see how much you're spinning it at all. Now on the ring type, it did. That was mechanically linked. So I always had the exact same amount of turn from front to back, from minimum object distance to infinity. On mirrorless, that's why you don't have that window anymore. It can't tell you, it doesn't know.
Right, it used to be in the old lenses before autofocus. They wanted a big throw because then you could be very, very
Super precise. Yes, sir. That is correct.
Now it's
Now it's arbitrary because it depends on how fast you're spinning it, how much the throw you're going to get will be. That's the by-wire. It is a compromise of the design, but there are ways some companies are getting around it. We'll swing back on that, I promise. So as a part of autofocus, there are things that the lens is in charge of, the things that it brings to the table to help the camera do what it does. An F ratio, a maximum F ratio of f4 to 2.8 to f2. The wider that F ratio gets, in theory, the more light that I'm going to get, and the more light that my autofocus matrix has, and the shallower space between edges, the more precise it can be, the better it is for the camera to be able to see. Stabilization actually helps. If I'm shaking and I've got my autofocus point, but it's moving from the wing to the eye to the leg to the wing to the eye to the leg, the camera doesn't know exactly what I'm trying to focus on. But if I'm stabilized and it stays on the wing, even though I'm shaking, it is much more accurate. Makes perfect sense. With an autofocus motor, I bring to the table the potential for speed. Spool up to grab the subject, the speed of acquisition, the speed at which it can track and change direction and respond to commands, and the speed at which it will stop and be accurate at the precise moment I ask it to focus and quit. Slower autofocus motors aren't always precise. Some will stop a little in front, some will stop a little in back, especially on DSLRs. We have less of that problem with mirrorless, but a better autofocus motor has better potential for better autofocus performance. Hoods, they do actually help if you are on a bright summer day and you have a lot of issues with flaring. Flare causes lower contrast, causes missed autofocus opportunities because the autofocus system can't see as well. Hoods do help with that. There is one problem though, and that is especially early mornings when it's really humid, or especially during the winter time, if you are working with a large lens with a big scoop hood, that hood can trap the heat from your sensor and create inversion in front of your front element and cause you to have unsharp images. So if you are shooting in the morning in winter, believe it or not, it's better to take your hood off and you will have fewer aberrations in your shot. Some things you just never have to consider, that the camera is creating enough heat to ruin my shot. That's unbelievable. And then also, yes, the extra aside, we discussed it previously. Please use good filters. If you don't, you will not get good images. I do joke all the time, if you buy a cheap UV protector, you are protecting yourself from good images. That's what it does. It does. It happens. It's true. I think I brought it too. I was teaching a class in Yellowstone last year, and this unfortunate soul had one of our lenses. Not unfortunate that she had one of our lenses, but it had come with this free polarizer. The polarizer is possibly the worst filter I've ever seen in my life. I kept it. It's such an anomaly. It shifted everything to the green-blue spectrum, so it was a great polarizer. It also completely killed her autofocus. It could not see. The camera would hunt and hunt and hunt and hunt and hunt. Take the polarizer off, no problems. Put it back on, can't. It blinded everything. And it has the weirdest veiling aberration. Like, it's not a clear piece of glass. It's like someone took a portal off of the Titanic and put it on the front of your element. It's terrible. But I did bring it because as an object lesson. I need that. If you are still on DSLRs, you do still have to deal with the occasional focus problem of back focus or front focus. This is a communication issue between the camera and the lens, and it is sometimes the camera that's the problem. Sometimes the lens is perfectly calibrated and the camera is not. And so you have to tell the lens to learn the quirks of the camera or vice versa. A lot of the cameras have a micro AF adjust module on board. It is so-so. It's a good quick fix, but it is not the best of fixes. If you really want to do it yourself, I recommend this software. If you're a DSLR user, Focal Pro is the best there is for home focus calibration. It's the only one that can do it well below 24 millimeter, and definitely the only one that can do it well above 200 millimeter. Those extremities matter. And it's nice because most of the SLRs you can now plug into your laptop. You'll print your target, put it out at the distance they tell you to, and it will run your camera through the test mode and measure your quirks for you. And it does a pretty good job. It is not as good as sending your camera and your lens into the manufacturer to get calibrated. But if you don't want to ever do that, this might be 6 to 8 hours of your life you can't get back. But for DSLRs, calibration is a part of your life. Do not assume you do not need it just because you've never done it. You probably do. It's a revelation when your lens is properly calibrated. It's unreal what it can do for you.
And mirrorless is pretty much.
Mirrorless, it does a really good job of almost eliminating it. It's not error-free, but it is mostly error-free. And it's because the sensor is the autofocus unit. When the same eyes that are looking at the image are also capturing the image, you're going to have far fewer errors. It's true. It does make a difference. And because today's stepper and linear motors are also far more accurate in the movement they can make. They're moving in elements thinner than a human hair. So their precision is unbelievable. So mirrorless autofocus really is better than DSLR autofocus in pretty much every fact. And then the shaping of the background of the image, it's true. If you go into the forums today, this word is their obsession, the bokeh. It's not boca, bokeh is mouth. That's a Spanish word, by the way. Bokeh does mean area of diffusion or not sharp. And photographers use it in terms of the effects of the area that is not sharp. This is determined vastly by not just your spherical correction in your lens, but also how many blades you have in your aperture diaphragm. If you're a portrait photographer in particular, if you want the smoothest, creamiest possible bokeh in the background, you want more blades in your iris. You will get more circular, specular highlights. You'll have smoother gradation from front to back and around edges. It won't be so harsh on the transitions from front to back. And if you are a landscape photographer, more blades give you more points on your star, on your sun star. So that's also nice to have. And then rounded blades will assist in the uniformity. So if I'm working with, say, a macro lens, and I'm trying to determine what exactly is going to be out of focus, if I take my shot, a rounded blade will allow that out of focus element to gradually fade better instead of having a hard field between them, where it looks a little more like a binocular instead. So this is a good example of having a rounded iris versus a non-rounded iris. On the left, we have a 9-bladed rounded iris, and on the right, we have a 7-bladed non-rounded iris. This is where the forums will go off and argue for the next 40 days and 40 nights. I like them both. I actually think they're both really nice, and I think they both have their uses. But if I'm a professional portrait photographer, I'm probably leaning towards the circles on the right, and it's because humans have a tendency to prefer the softer, round, symmetrical blobs. Because the 7 blades on the right just look a little harsh. Now, if you do have a lens baby, a lot of those have the ability to pull the aperture out and place another shape in there. You can do hearts, you can do stars, you can do diamonds, you can do all the Lucky Charms if you want. And some lenses made their bones on being able to change the shape of the iris. That's totally on you, which is why it's completely subjective. I like both. I think they're great. One of the things to note, I don't know if you guys can see this too well, but I don't know if you can see the onion rings in the pattern here on these little balls here. Yeah. So that is the major compromise for aspheric elements. You are looking at the mold and polish pattern of your lens. So that is why we get these little onion rings, because that is what's left of my lens. Now on the side here, the 7-bladed non-rounded iris, I don't have any sort of pattern, and that tells me that this lens is probably pretty old and has no aspheric elements in it. So which one is better? Totally on you. But if I have 9 rounded blades and I've got good glass, I can separate even at f11 if I have a reasonable telephoto lens. This is at 300 millimeter, and that background is awesome. It's just blurry and gone. And this is a $1,500 lens. And so we would expect this from a $1,500 lens. However, when you put 9 rounded blades in a $400 lens, you can get awesome background characteristics from your $400 lens. Both of these are at 300 millimeter. Both are awesome. And I couldn't tell you which lens shot them if I didn't already know it myself. Here's a good example of that macro where we go from f5.6 to f57. Those rounded blades kept all that contrast under control. No flaring, no blooming, everything nice and soft. The gradations are excellent. And then when I stop everything down, I don't have any blooming or flaring or anything else on the edges that are still soft. This is a really brilliant example on exactly what to expect from good bokeh control. And this is exactly what we've been talking about this entire time. I have one added aspect to this presentation that's going to take 5 minutes after this, but this is what we discussed the entire way through. This is a crop section, I should say the exploded diagram of our 35 millimeter 1.8 stabilized. You'll notice that we have a ring type autofocus motor right here. We have our stabilization unit right here. We have a 9 rounded bladed iris right here. And then we have our rear apochromat triplet right here, all into a dual MPU computerized board all the way into the back for chipset and communication to, in this case, a Canon product. That's a Canon mount. It's a phenomenal setup. They're extraordinarily complex creatures, and their job is to try and simplify your life to the best of their ability, and it's all rather fascinating. So I'm pleased that you were able to sit with me through this portion of things, but now you get to find out what's coming up. So this is where I have to actually change my share to you. So the problem is that we have a situation where the lens era of today is the golden age. We are in the best era of optical design in the history of cameras. We really don't have bad lenses. I am. You got it. Cool. So what happens is we have to not just give you good glass, but we now have to give you a better user experience. If you've noticed, the one thing camera manufacturers have refused to do is simplify menus or trim them down at all. They keep adding pages and folders and all these other aspects, and it's because they are competing against mobile phones. They're not competing against each other anymore. They're competing against the iPhone. They're competing against the Samsung Galaxy. They're definitely competing against the Google Fold, right? So they're trying to give you more capabilities on your camera. And then it comes now to the lens manufacturers to assist in that. And so we have begun developing smart lenses. And today's lens from Tamron as we move through will, in this case, although you won't necessarily be able to see it, will have a USB-C port right on board the lens. It is completely weather sealed. Yes, it's submersible like an iPhone would be. Please don't. But what that allows me to do is, in this particular case, turn it into basically a flash drive. And I can go in and actually customize the behaviors of my lens. So I have 2 vectors that I can customize. I can customize the manual focus ring and what it's capable of. And then I can also customize my switches and what they're capable of. Right now I have everything pretty much cleared out, but going back to our conversation recently, Dave, the manual focus capabilities. When your lens, mirrorless lens comes out of the box, it's in non-linear or by-wire autofocus and manual focus mode. And that's what we were talking about, where I can spin the ring as fluidly as I want, and I really don't know how fast or how far it's going to go. It'll just keep spinning and do whatever. However, videographers cannot have that, and honestly, I'm not a videographer and I can't have that. That destroys my ability to refine my focus the way that I would like to. So what I can do now is I can tell it to go linear, and I can tell it to simulate a mechanical manual focus device. And in this particular case, I can tell the lens I want it to be a 90-degree turn between minimum object distance to infinity, 180, 270, or 360. So I can set the amount of rotation on my ring. I can even tape the spots on my ring because it will be exactly the same every time. I prefer 180 degrees. I like a nice half turn. It's fast enough that I can do it quickly if I need to. It's also a small enough amount that I can be pretty well refined. The only time I would change this is if I had an actual macro lens in front of me, and I would probably go 360. and give myself a lot of throw for that. But here I've got it set for linear, 180, saved. The lens is now programmed as a mechanical manual focus device.
Would you also do that for, say, some of the new wide angle 1.4 meant for stars?
Oh, sure.
With 180, I mean, would you make it more so?
I'd probably actually I'd go more for stars. I probably would if I was doing manual focus work, because stars take some refinement, and I'd rather have more movement than less to allow for that. It's a really good question. So it's funny that you mentioned that though, because on my switch here, I've got a switch with 3 positions on the side of this lens, and I have a button next to that switch position. The position of the switch determines what that button does. So I have 3 buttons essentially that I'm capable of. And for our star people, I would make my first position focus preset. And what I can do on this lens is I'll go out into the field, and at 35 f2, which is probably what I'm shooting my starry skies with, I will manually focus so that my stars are sharp, hold the lens, and it will never forget that as long as it lives. I'll go back to focusing on other things, and when I hit the button, my stars are sharp again. It has never forgotten that.
Won't it be a problem with temperature though?
Barely, not with this type of movement. It'd have to be real cold, like super cold. Maybe like -17, -20. I don't have to worry about it so
That
much.
was always you.
Now, I may have some issues with atmospheric conversion, but there's only so much I can do with that. There are just some nights that are just terrible for star photography. That's just how life works.
I was gonna say in the old lenses, you could always focus past infinity.
Yep.
And it just depended, you'd start a night in 35 degrees and then go down to.
So on our DSLR lenses, you know, we have the Mobius strip, the infinity symbol, right? We would 0-point calibrate that. So our infinity was actually at the center of the Mobius cross. And so you could put your lens at that point, and that is what we were measured to be infinity at the factory. Rarely did you ever have to go beyond it. Usually you had to shorten up a touch for stars on those. But these guys have a hard infinity, and they have a hard minimum object distance. What's funny though is that some of their minimum object distances will actually change when they're in manual focus. Linear motors have to be a specific distance to work correctly for autofocus. And there are times for some lenses when you switch to manual focus and you get an extra throw to work even closer at higher magnification. It's a hidden value. They don't advertise it because it's only going to really be sharp in the center. But if you need an ad hoc proto macro lens, a lot of them will do it if you switch into macro on the wide angle side. It's kind of fun. So this is a good way for that to take place. I'll have it remember one specific focal distance, and I can always go back to it just by hitting the button, right? And in this case, I can also tell it how fast I want it to be to get to that position. Do I want it to jump and just nail it, or do I want it to take a few seconds to get there as if I'm shooting a video track? Save it. I can also have it do 2 points, A-B autofocus. I can have it remember point 1, and I can have it remember point 2, and I can set the tracking speed between those 2 points. So when I hit the button, it goes to point 2, hit the button again, it goes back to point 1. So my interviewers can program this lens with chair 1 and chair 2, and as the conversation is taking place live, they'll just hit the button and switch between their 2 subjects as they go. I can also hit the button and maybe change my ring type from autofocus, manual focus to be my aperture diaphragm. So if I hit the button, now my manual focus ring turns into my f-stop ring. Hit the button again, it goes back to being my manual focus ring. Little things like that where I can really customize this lens and make it my personal creature in the context of what I'm shooting right now. This is not something that I'll necessarily do every single day otherwise. And what takes it even further, return and remove, is the scariest thing ever, is the fact that something I unfortunately can't show you guys on screen, but the fact that I'll just plug it directly into my phone and my Tamron app will boot up, and now I can do it live in situ while videotaping my weddings. So now I can actually set up to 6 different points throughout the room with 6 different tracking features, and I can set everything live, reset, rehearse with the bride, the groom, do everything. And by the time we're set, my B-roll guy, I just go, hit the button when they get here, hit this button when they get here, and hit this button when they get here. And it just does it, and it looks cinematic automatically. And everything that you saw previously, I can program into the lens live directly from the phone now as well. So maybe I am having some temperature issues. Well, that night I'll just reprogram it, get my stars sharp for that night, have it saved, and I just did it right now, and it's overridden for right now. Little things like that. So we're trying to give you the ability to take your whole photographic and videographic experience and really own it technologically. The glass is good. There are very few bad lenses out there. I can probably pick 3 that I would never sell to anyone, and most of them are older anyway. But in the long haul, they're all at least average, if not better than average, to unbelievable, depending on what your regards are. But taking you further down the road, this is what we're going to be doing to play our part in making cameras better at doing what they do and giving you more ability to become more diverse in your genres and what you're able to capture. Because today's kids coming out of college, they got to know both video and stills. You can't make a living just as a still photographer anymore in commercial work. You better have video under your hood now, because your client's going to ask you when you get there, hey, by the way, we got this little thing else after you're done. Can you shoot some video for us? And the answer should be, yeah, absolutely I can. Let me just get set up here. And this makes it a lot faster to be able to do that. So that's where things are going after all the stuff you saw about where things are and have been. So, and that is the whole presentation. And I really appreciate you guys having me out. I hope it was worth your time. So,
Oh, yeah.
thank you. Right now we have 4 smart lenses. This guy, the 35 to 150 f2 to 2.8. We have the 50 to 400, which has some wicked programmability for the wildlife photographer. We have the 20 to 40 2.8, which is our blogging lens. And remember, small lenses with that ridiculously overperforming autofocus motor. That's one of them. And then we have just the standard 28 to 75 2.8 generation 2. And they all have different levels of programmability, but those are the 4 for right now. But there's no question we wouldn't be investing in an app and the user utility for Mac and PC and all of that architecture on board to just stop at 4 lenses. I'm sure we've got other stuff taking place. So
we got one question. I don't know if you got an answer. I don't know if you heard the answer to that with regards to turning off the IS.
it is better to do so. If you didn't, don't kick yourself over it, but it is better to do so.
So I have, I guess, 5 Tamron lenses, and I've had real good success with them, including that 150 to 600. I really like that one for some of my outdoor stuff and that. Question though is, so I've had those with my Nikon, the DSLR, the D750, D850, and now I have the Z, so Z7 too. And I know there's one Tamron lens already out there. Actually, I got a chance to try it out. It's for the Z mount. It was it 100, 300, something like that?
7300.
7300, right. And worked great. Are they?
Those will be native.
I'm guessing that since they have already done one, that's more in the works, more in the design for the Z mount.
I would say it's a safe bet. So Nikon, what they did, and Canon's kind of doing the same also in their own way. Completely, of course, their prerogative. It's their IP. It's their architecture. We were all really spoiled in DSLRs, and it was because the mounts and the communication protocols hadn't changed from the film days. So everything was basically open source, for lack of a better. It was almost essentially open source. So we could almost do whatever we wanted often without license or without writ. Being Tamron and being that we have a lot of different partnerships, we worked really well with everybody else, and so our lenses have always worked well with everybody else. Mirrorless, though, was an opportunity for the camera manufacturers to take all that back. Now the mounts are very proprietary. The communication protocols are very proprietary. It's all their IP. And Sony has been very open and giving, which was very un-Sony-like. If you remember the old Sony from the early 2000s, where we called them Standard Oil New York, that's what SONY stood for. They didn't share well with others, but they understood in imaging that sharing well was the key to success. And they were the guys that first said, adapt it all, man, put it on here. Let's see what we can do with it. Let's go. And it's because they knew that they were the guy that had the most to gain, and they were able to build an empire, and they were #1 in mirrorless forever, right? But Nikon and Canon being #1 and #2 in DSLRs really didn't have to worry about that for so long. But now in mirrorless, what they'll do is Nikon in particular just went public, and they basically said, look, we don't want any more duplicate lenses. So the days of Sigma having a 24-70 and Tamron having a 24-70 and Nikon having a 24-70, those are gone.
Okay.
So what's going to happen is you're going to see some very interesting focal lengths, like say a 35-150 f2.28
Right.
or a 50-400. Tamron's always been awesome and innovative in their focal lengths anyway. We've always bucked the curve for most of the things. This is not our first 35-150. This is our second. We did the first 28-105 2.8 back in the 90s. You know, we had some really crazy stuff happening. So for us, this is nothing new. But what it does allow for is that I don't have a duplicate lens. You know, I'm not here to stand on Nikon's stone. So our 70-300 is a really good example. Nikon does not have a 70-300 in their entire lineup.
Right.
We just now filled that gap. And I think that's kind of what they're looking at for third party. Don't want to put too many words in their mouth, but they did say no duplicate lenses. They really want third party to be basically gap fillers, which is honestly smart because that means the Nikon will have a core system. And then anything third party is able to do will only round it out even further and give you a really good palette of lenses to choose from. It doesn't matter who it is.
So Canon's supposedly starting to open up their RF mount of users.
We haven't seen anything about that.
Yet.
No, and like there was a rumor that Sigma might, but it was like a CR1 or whatever. Like they posted it for clicks, as far as we can tell. But we have nothing to say for it. There's nothing on our side that we know of. So, and that's, Canon knows. It's to be blunt, and this may talk out of class a little bit, but you know, these days are not the 90s where third party were cheap alternatives. You know, and it has occasionally one winner out of the bunch. Now, what we always were, both Sigma and Tamron and Tokina as well, were world-class optics manufacturers that were just basically just chilling, doing our thing. And with Tamron, we've always been able to do so many other things. It didn't matter so much, but you know, if now Tamron and Sigma, we're world-class and we're in public about it. And so for us, if they decide to open up the mount, they know that their lens sales are probably going to drop, and it's better for them to protect it while they can. I dig it.
I don't see any other questions from online.
Cool.
For those of you that aren't here, we'll probably end this because we're probably going to do a little show and tell, and then we'll leave before the police show up. So hopefully,
Yeah, because Bruce is going to try to steal my glass.
yeah. Don't forget, you can if you haven't paid for the Rambo Ranch. He's going to have all these lenses. You'll have an opportunity to bring your camera and take a look at them, play with them. It's $24 on the site. 20 of it goes to pay your way into the Rambler Ranch, and we're getting an extra couple of dollars just to pay some other stuff. But it's going to be a good time to come out. You don't have to stay all day. It's basically 8 to noon, and come out and have a little fun to see some good fun.
Yeah, we're going to have a ball.
Yep. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. Good night. Thank you.